The morning sun cast long shadows across the Quantico firing range as Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb adjusted his tactical vest, the familiar weight of his SEAL trident catching the light. Around him, the usual crowd of weekend warriors and active duty personnel prepared their weapons with the casual confidence of those who'd never truly been tested. The air smelled of gun oil and masculine bravado, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter from the group of Marines clustered near Lane 7. That's when she walked in. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of muscle memory earned through repetition, not performance. Her civilian clothes, worn jeans, a faded University of Colorado sweatshirt, and scuffed hiking boots marked her as an outsider among the pressed uniforms and tactical gear. The woman appeared to be in her early 30s, with shoulder-length auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and the kind of sun-weathered complexion that came from years under an unforgiving sky. "Ma'am, you sure you're in the right place?" called out Staff Sergeant Rodriguez from Lane 3, his voice carrying just enough condescension to draw snickers from his buddies. "This isn't exactly a beginner's course." She didn't respond immediately, instead focusing on the paperwork at the range master's desk with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to details mattering. When she finally looked up, her gray-green eyes held a stillness that made Webb pause in his weapon inspection. "I think I can manage," she said simply, her voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested years of shouting over aircraft engines. The Marines exchanged glances, their grins widening. "What's your background, sweetheart?" Rodriguez pressed, the endearment dripping with mockery. "Couple weekends at the local gun club." She signed the final form and turned toward the equipment locker, rolling up her sleeves as she moved. That's when Webb saw it, a small tattoo on the inside of her left wrist, partially obscured by her watchband. His breath caught as recognition hit him like a physical blow. The insignia was barely 2 inches across, a pair of wings wrapped around a shield, with a lightning bolt cutting through the center. Below it, in numbers so small they were almost invisible, read 160th SOAR. But it wasn't the Special Operations Aviation Regiment marking that made Webb's hands go still on his rifle. It was the additional detail most people would miss: a tiny skull and crossbones nestled within the lightning bolt's curve. Night Stalkers, and not just any Night Stalker. The woman at Lane 12 wasn't some civilian looking for a weekend thrill. She was one of the most elite helicopter pilots in the world, trained to insert and extract special operations forces in the darkest corners of the planet. The skull and crossbones indicated she'd flown direct action missions, the kind where failure meant watching good men die in foreign soil. Webb's tactical vest suddenly felt heavier as memories flooded back. "Phoenix, this is Talon 6. We need immediate extract, danger close, how copy?" The voice crackled through the radio with the controlled urgency of a man watching his world collapse. Major Elena Vasquez gripped the cyclic of her MH-60M Black Hawk, her knuckles white against the black leather of her flight gloves as tracer rounds streaked past the cockpit like deadly fireworks. The year was 2019, and the mountains of eastern Afghanistan held secrets that men died to protect. Below her, pinned against a rocky outcropping in the Spingar Range, a 12-man SEAL team had walked into an ambush that would later be classified beyond the reach of congressional oversight. The mission parameters had been simple: extract a high-value target before dawn. Reality, as always, had other plans. "Talon 6, Phoenix, I have visual on your position." Elena's voice cut through the static with the calm precision of someone who'd made peace with impossible odds. "Marking LZ with infrared strobe, 200 meters northwest of your current position. You'll have to move." Through her night vision goggles, the landscape below resembled an alien world painted in shades of green and white. Muzzle flashes bloomed like deadly flowers across the ridgeline as Taliban fighters closed the noose around the trapped Americans. Her co-pilot, Chief Warrant Officer David Kim, worked the defensive systems with the focused intensity of a surgeon, chaff and flares erupting around their aircraft like a metallic aurora. Phoenix, negative on the movement, came the reply from team leader Lieutenant Commander Webb. We've got wounded and approximately 40 hostiles between us and your LZ. Request gun run to clear the path. Alina's jaw tightened. Standard operating procedure dictated she wait for Apache support or pull back to a safe distance. But the men below her didn't have time for procedure. She could hear it in Webb's voice, the controlled desperation of a leader watching his team bleed out under a foreign sky. Kim, give me everything we've got on that ridgeline, she ordered, banking the Black Hawk into a diving turn that made her stomach press against her spine. The aircraft's twin M134 miniguns spun to life, their electric whine rising above the rotor wash like the voice of some mechanical god. The darkness erupted in sheets of flame as 7.6 Tomb rounds poured from her aircraft at 4,000 rounds per minute. Tracers drew geometric patterns across the night sky, each line representing dozens of bullets designed to turn human beings into statistics. She held the trigger down for exactly 7 seconds, long enough to suppress the enemy, short enough to avoid overheating the barrels. Talon 6, path is clear. You have 90 seconds before they regroup, Alina transmitted, already swinging the aircraft toward the extraction point. The Black Hawk settled onto the rocky ground with the delicate precision of a surgeon's scalpel, rotor wash creating a hurricane of dust and debris that turned the world into a brownout nightmare. Alina held the aircraft steady through pure instinct, her hands moving across the controls with the muscle memory of someone who'd landed in worse conditions. Through the swirling dust, shapes materialized like ghosts, 12 men moving in the tactical formation that separated professionals from pretenders. She could see the blood on their uniforms, the way 2 of them supported a third whose left leg hung at an unnatural angle. These weren't the clean warriors of recruitment posters. They were human beings who'd stared into the abyss and somehow found the strength to keep fighting. Webb was the last man aboard, his eyes meeting Alina's in the rearview mirror for just an instant. In that moment, she saw something that would haunt her dreams for years to come, the look of a man who'd watched good people die and couldn't shake the feeling that he should have joined them. Phoenix, all souls aboard, get us the hell out of here. Webb's voice cut through the intercom with the exhausted relief of someone who just cheated death. Alina didn't need to be told twice. The Black Hawk leaped into the sky like a caged bird suddenly freed, climbing through the thin mountain air with the desperate urgency of prey escaping a predator. Below them, muzzle flashes continued to sparkle across the ridgeline, but they were already beyond the reach of small arms fire. Bagram Tower, this is Phoenix Flight inbound with wounded personnel, requesting priority landing and medical standby. Alina transmitted as the lights of the airbase appeared in the distance like a constellation of hope. The flight back to Bagram took 43 minutes. For Webb and his team, it was 43 minutes to process what they'd survived. For Alina, it was 43 minutes to replay every decision she'd made, wondering if there was something she could have done differently, something that might have prevented the blood she could smell through the aircraft's ventilation system. She didn't know then that this mission would define the rest of her career, that the call sign, Phoenix, would become legend among the special operations community. She only knew that 12 good men were going home to their families because she'd chosen to break protocol and trust her instincts. The tattoo on her wrist would come later, after the medals and the classified debriefings, and the sleepless nights when she could still hear Webb's voice calling for extract in a universe where sometimes help actually came. Back at Quantico, Webb studied the woman at Lane 12 with new eyes. The mockery from the Marines had died away as she methodically assembled her rifle with the kind of professional competence that spoke louder than any boasting. Each movement was precise, economical, speaking of training that went far beyond weekend hobbyist shooting. Rodriguez, Webb called softly, his voice carrying the authority that came with leading men in places where leadership meant the difference between going home and going home in a box. Stand down. The staff sergeant looked confused, his swagger faltering as he registered the change in his commander's tone. "Sir, I was just—" "I know what you were doing," Webb interrupted, his eyes never leaving the woman who was now adjusting her rifle's scope with the methodical precision of someone who understood that accuracy meant survival. "And now you're going to stop." Alina, though Webb didn't yet know her name, chambered her first round and settled into a shooting position that spoke of countless hours on ranges far more dangerous than this one. Her breathing settled into the controlled rhythm of someone who'd learned to find stillness in chaos, to locate that moment between heartbeats where the shot lived. The first round punched through the target's center mass with surgical precision. The second followed before the echo of the first had faded. Then a third, fourth, and fifth in a grouping so tight it looked like a single hole torn through the paper. The range fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant sound of traffic from the highway. Rodriguez's mouth hung open like a man who just watched someone walk on water. The other Marines shuffled uncomfortably, their earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. Alina ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and set the rifle down with the same methodical care she'd shown in assembling it. Only then did she look up, her gray-green eyes moving across the faces of the men who'd been so quick to dismiss her. "Ma'am," Webb said, approaching slowly with the respect due to someone who'd earned it in places where respect was paid in blood. "I think we may have met before." She studied his face with the careful attention of someone trained to remember details that might matter later. Recognition dawned slowly, like sunrise breaking over a battlefield, and when it came, her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Afghanistan," she said simply. 2019, Spin Gar Mountains." "You pulled my team out of hell that night," Webb replied, his voice carrying the weight of a debt that could never be fully repaid. The conversation that followed happened away from the others, two professionals sharing memories that civilian minds weren't equipped to process. They spoke in the shorthand of people who'd seen the elephant, their words carrying meanings that went far beyond their literal definitions. Alina Vasquez. That was her name, though most of the people who mattered had only known her as Phoenix. She'd flown 137 combat missions across 3 deployments, extracting teams that weren't supposed to exist from places that didn't appear on any map. The skull and crossbones on her tattoo represented 17 direct action missions, where she'd provided close air support with nothing but door guns and pure audacity. "Why'd you get out?" Webb asked as they sat on the bench overlooking the rifle range, watching Marines who suddenly seemed very young practicing with weapons they'd probably never use in anger. Alina was quiet for a long moment, her fingers unconsciously tracing the insignia on her wrist. "After Spingar, they offered me a promotion, desk job back at Bragg, chance to train the next generation of Night Stalkers." She paused, watching a red-tailed hawk circle overhead with the kind of freedom she remembered from 10,000 feet above hostile territory. "But I'd been flying combat missions for 8 years. My reflexes weren't what they used to be, and in our business, slow reflexes get good people killed." Webb nodded, understanding the weight of that decision in ways most people never could. In the special operations community, knowing when to step back required the same courage as knowing when to step forward. "So what now?" he asked. "Teaching," she replied with a slight smile that transformed her entire face. "Aviation program at Colorado State. Turns out civilian pilots need to learn some of the same skills we used over there, just without people shooting at them." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two veterans processing the strange sensation of existing in a world where their particular skill sets were no longer required. Around them, the business of the firing range continued. Marines practicing, weekend warriors playing at war, the eternal dance of human beings preparing for conflicts they hoped would never come. "Phoenix," Webb said finally, using her call sign with the respect it deserved. "That night in the mountains, you saved more than just my team. My youngest guy, Peters, his wife was pregnant. Kid's 3 years old now, calls me Uncle Marcus. He exists because you decided to break protocol and trust your instincts." Alina turned to look at him, her gray-green eyes holding depths that spoke of nights when sleep brought dreams of falling aircraft and burning fuel. "We all made it home," she said simply. "That's what matters." The range master's voice cut through the afternoon air, calling for the next rotation of shooters. Around them, the Marines from earlier were packing up their gear with considerably less swagger than they'd displayed that morning. Rodriguez approached hesitantly, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that looked suspiciously like humility. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying none of its previous condescension, "I wanted to apologize for being an ass." Alina studied him with the same careful attention she'd given to landing zones under fire. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," she said, reading his name tape. "How long have you been in?" "6 years, ma'am. 2 deployments to Iraq, 1 to Syria." "Ever been in a situation where you needed emergency extraction?" Rodriguez's expression shifted, memories playing across his face like shadows. "Once. IED took out our convoy's lead vehicle outside Ramadi. We were pinned down for 4 hours waiting for air support." "Who came for you?" "Marine Air Wing," he replied, pride evident in his voice. "Cobras and a sea night. Most beautiful sight I ever saw." Alina nodded slowly. "The pilot who flew that sea night probably looked just like me when she wasn't in her flight suit. Maybe somebody's mom or sister or daughter trying to bring good people home." She paused, letting the words sink in. "The aircraft don't care what we look like, Sergeant. They only care whether we can fly them." The lesson hit home with the impact of a well-placed round. Rodriguez straightened unconsciously, his bearing shifting from chastened recruit to professional Marine. "Understood, ma'am. It won't happen again." After he walked away, Webb turned to Alina with an expression that mixed admiration with something deeper. "You could have destroyed him, made him look like a fool in front of his men." "What would that accomplish?" Alina replied, watching Rodriguez rejoin his team with noticeably better posture. "He made a mistake based on assumptions. We all do that. The question is whether we learn from it." Webb considered this as they gathered their gear, preparing to leave the range where so much had been revealed in so little time. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded him of tracer rounds seen from a safe distance. "Phoenix," he said as they reached the parking lot. "My team trains here every month, if you're ever in the area." "I might just take you up on that," Alina replied, climbing into a well-worn Toyota Tacoma that had seen more miles than most aircraft. "Fair warning, though, I don't go easy on people just because we're not getting shot at." As Alina drove away from Quantico, the weight of the afternoon settled around her like an old flight jacket, familiar, comfortable, but carrying memories that would never fully fade. The encounter with Rodriguez and his Marines had been a reminder of how the world saw her now. A middle-aged woman in civilian clothes, unmarked by the experiences that had defined her professional life. But Webb's recognition had been something else entirely. For a brief moment, she'd been Phoenix again, the pilot who'd flown impossible missions through hostile skies, who'd brought home teams that weren't supposed to survive their deployments. It was an identity she'd thought she'd left behind with her wings and her clearance, but apparently some things ran deeper than career changes. The highway stretched ahead through the Virginia countryside, farmland and forests broken by the occasional subdivision or strip mall. It was peaceful in a way that still sometimes surprised her. No threat assessments, no radio chatter, no need to scan the horizon for surface-to-air missiles. Just the ordinary challenge of civilian life, with its mundane concerns about mortgage payments and grocery shopping, and whether her truck would pass its next inspection. Her phone buzzed with a text from her department head at Colorado State. "How was the conference? Did you manage to network with any potential guest speakers?" Alina smiled. thinking about Webb and his team of SEALs. Dr. Morrison probably hadn't been thinking about active duty special operations personnel when he'd encouraged her to make professional connections. But then again, her definition of networking had always been a little unconventional. She pulled into a gas station outside Fredericksburg, the familiar ritual of fueling up providing a moment to process the day's events. As she stood beside her truck, watching other travelers go about their business with the blessed ignorance of people who'd never had to worry about incoming fire, Alina found herself thinking about legacy. In the military, legacy was measured in missions completed, lives saved, objectives achieved. Success was binary: you brought everyone home or you didn't. But in civilian life, the metrics were softer, harder to quantify. How did you measure the impact of teaching a 19-year-old aviation student the difference between flying and being a pilot? How did you calculate the value of showing someone like Rodriguez that assumptions could be dangerous, even when lives weren't hanging in the balance? The drive back to Colorado would take 2 days, with an overnight stop planned in Kansas. Alina had learned to appreciate the rhythm of long road trips, the way they provided space for thoughts that didn't have room in the structured environment of daily routine. The highway became a kind of meditation, miles of asphalt and white lines creating a space where past and present could coexist without conflict. As the sun set behind her, painting the eastern sky in shades that reminded her of night vision imagery, Alina thought about the students waiting for her return. They were good kids, mostly. Farm boys and ranch girls who'd grown up around aircraft, military veterans using their GI Bill benefits to chase childhood dreams of flight, and the occasional trust fund baby who thought aviation looked romantic. None of them had any idea what she'd done before arriving at their small agricultural college. To them, she was just Professor Vasquez, the instructor who was tougher than she looked, and who had an uncanny ability to spot dangerous habits before they became dangerous outcomes. They didn't know about the nights she'd flown through mountains with no moon, navigating by instruments and instinct while carrying men who'd volunteered for missions that officially didn't exist. Which was probably for the best. Her students needed to learn about lift and thrust, about weather patterns and navigation systems, about the thousand small skills that separated pilots from passengers. They didn't need to know about flying through ground fire or the particular sound a helicopter made when it was about to fall out of the sky. Those lessons belonged to a different world, one that most of them would never see and shouldn't have to. But sometimes, in the middle of a lesson about emergency procedures, or when a student asked why she insisted on practicing auto-rotations until they could do them in their sleep, Alina found herself drawing on experiences that couldn't be quantified in civilian terms. How did you explain that the difference between life and death often came down to muscle memory, to the ability to perform critical tasks when adrenaline turned fine motor skills into suggestions rather than commands? Her phone rang as she crossed into West Virginia, the Bluetooth connection filling the truck's cab with the voice of her sister calling from Seattle. They talked about ordinary things, family news, career updates, the perpetual challenge of maintaining relationships across geographical distance. Sarah didn't ask about her day at Quantico, probably assuming it had been another boring professional conference. Alina didn't volunteer details, continuing the careful compartmentalization that had become second nature during her military years. The hotel in Charleston was nothing special, a chain property designed for travelers who valued functionality over character. Alina checked in with the efficient politeness of someone who'd slept in far worse accommodations, grateful for the simple luxury of a room where no one would be shooting at her while she slept. After a shower that lasted longer than tactical considerations had allowed for 8 years, she sat on the bed with her laptop, catching up on emails from colleagues and students. The mundane concerns of academic life, budget meetings, curriculum reviews, graduation requirements, felt almost surreal after the afternoon's encounter with her former world. One email caught her attention, a message from the Veterans Affairs Office about a support group for female veterans dealing with post-deployment adjustment issues. Alina had been ignoring similar invitations for 3 years, convinced that she'd made the transition successfully without need for assistance. But something about the day's events made her reconsider. She thought about Rodriguez's assumptions, about the way his worldview had been challenged by evidence that contradicted his preconceptions. Maybe her own assumptions about strength and independence deserved similar scrutiny. Maybe admitting that some parts of military life were worth mourning didn't constitute weakness. The group met Thursday evenings at a community center in Fort Collins, according to the email. Alina made a mental note to check it out, then immediately questioned whether she actually would. Decision-making had been simpler in the military, where options were evaluated against clear mission parameters. Civilian choices carried different kinds of consequences, often harder to predict or quantify. Outside her window, Charleston's lights spread across the valley like a circuit board, each point of illumination representing lives being lived in the ordinary comfort of a nation at peace. It was easy to forget, in the daily routine of teaching and grading and department meetings, that such peace was neither accidental nor guaranteed. Someone somewhere was standing watch tonight, pilots like she'd been, soldiers like Webb still was, men and women whose names would never appear in history books, but whose dedication made ordinary life possible. Alina fell asleep thinking about her students, wondering which of them might someday find themselves flying missions that couldn't be discussed at faculty meetings. The thought was both sobering and oddly comforting, the eternal cycle of experience passed from one generation to the next, ensuring that critical knowledge survived even when the individuals who'd earned it moved on to other chapters of their lives. The second day of driving took her through Kansas, where the horizon stretched endlessly in all directions like a vast ocean of grain and grassland. Alina had always found something meditative about the Great Plains, the way they reduced human concerns to their proper scale, providing perspective that was harder to find in more confined landscapes. She stopped for lunch in a truck stop outside Hayes, taking a seat at the counter between a long-haul driver discussing load schedules and a farmer complaining about commodity prices. The conversation flowed around her with the comfortable anonymity of public spaces, allowing her to observe without participating, to exist in the space between her former identity and her current one. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with the kind of efficiency that came from decades of practice, refilled Alina's coffee without being asked. "Traveling far?" she inquired with the polite interest of someone who'd heard every possible variation of human story. "Colorado," Alina replied, "heading home." "Good time of year for it," the waitress noted, moving on to the next customer with practiced ease. Home. The word carried different meanings now than it had during her military years, when home had been wherever her unit was stationed, wherever the mission required her presence. Now home was a small house near the Colorado State campus, with a garden she was still learning to tend and neighbors who knew her as the quiet professor who kept unusual hours. It was a good life, she reminded herself. Peaceful, productive, free from the constant alertness that had defined her military service. Her students learned from her experience without having to acquire it through the same dangerous means. She was making a difference in the world, just through different methods. But driving through the vastness of Kansas, with hours of road stretching ahead and nothing but her thoughts for company, Alina couldn't shake the feeling that something had been awakened by her encounter with Webb. Not a desire to return to military service, that chapter of her life was definitively closed, but a recognition that her experiences had value beyond the classroom. Maybe it was time to stop hiding from what she'd been. Maybe there were ways to honor her service without returning to it, to use her story as something more than just cautionary tales about aerodynamic principles. The young Marines at Quantico hadn't known about her background when they'd made their assumptions, but their ignorance had revealed something important about how society viewed its veterans. Alina reached Fort Collins as the sun was setting behind the Rockies, painting the mountains in shades that reminded her of sunset flights over Afghanistan. The familiar sight of the university campus, with its mixture of historic brick buildings and modern additions, provided the comfort of routine after 2 days of highway solitude. Her house sat in a quiet neighborhood where professors and graduate students maintained an uneasy coexistence with the families who'd called Fort Collins home, long before the university had grown into its current prominence. Alina had chosen the location for its proximity to both campus and the local airport, where she occasionally rented aircraft for personal flights, maintaining the skills that had once been critical to her survival. Inside, the house reflected the careful balance she'd struck between past and present. Her living room held textbooks and academic journals alongside photographs from her military service, pictures of aircraft and crews that told stories she couldn't share with her civilian colleagues. Her study contained flight manuals, both military and civilian, maintaining dual fluencies in worlds that rarely intersected. She'd been home less than an hour when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was familiar: Northern Virginia, where Quantico was located. Professor Vasquez. The voice was young, nervous, carrying the particular tension of someone making a call they weren't sure they should be making. Yes. Ma'am, this is Corporal Davis from the range today. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez gave me your number. Well, Commander Webb gave it to him, and he thought. We were wondering. The young Marine's words tumbled over each other with the enthusiasm of youth confronting possibility. Slow down, Corporal, Alina said gently, settling into her kitchen chair with the patience of someone who'd learned to let nervous people find their words. What can I do for you? Well, ma'am, we were talking after you left, and Rodriguez told us about what Commander Webb said about you being a pilot in Afghanistan. And we thought, we were wondering if maybe you might want to come talk to our unit sometime. About flying, about what it's really like. Alina was quiet for a moment, considering the request and its implications. Speaking to military units about her experiences would mean stepping back into a world she'd deliberately left behind, claiming an identity she'd been content to let fade into history. But something about the young Marine's request resonated with her encounter with Rodriguez, with the recognition that assumptions could be challenged and minds could be changed. The following Monday, Alina stood in front of her introduction to aviation class, looking out at 23 faces that ranged from eager to skeptical to merely present. It was her first class since returning from the conference, and she'd spent the weekend thinking about the questions Corporal Davis had raised. Before we continue with our discussion of aerodynamic principles, she began, I want to talk about something that happened to me over the weekend. It's about assumptions and why they can be dangerous even when lives aren't at stake. She told them about the firing range, about the Marines who'd made judgments based on incomplete information, about the moment when professional recognition had shifted the entire dynamic of the encounter. She didn't mention her call sign or the specific details of her military service, but she spoke about the importance of competence over appearance, of substance over surface impressions. In aviation, she concluded, assumptions can kill you. Whether that looks manageable from the ground can turn deadly at altitude. Aircraft that appear airworthy can have hidden mechanical issues. Pilots who seem inexperienced can have more training than you'd imagine. Your job, as future aviators, is to gather information before making decisions. Test your assumptions against reality. One student, a ranch kid named Miller whose family had been flying agricultural aircraft for 3 generations, raised his hand. Professor, were you really a military pilot? Alina met his gaze steadily. I was, for 8 years, and every lesson I learned in that service makes me a better instructor today. The classroom atmosphere shifted subtly, as if her students were seeing her through new eyes. Not because her credentials had changed. She'd always been qualified to teach them, but because the context of her knowledge had expanded. She was no longer just an academic who understood theory. She was someone who'd applied that theory under conditions where mistakes had consequences beyond failed grades. After class, several students lingered with questions that went beyond the curriculum. They wanted to know about military aviation, about the differences between civilian and combat flying, about whether her experiences had influenced her teaching methods. Alina answered carefully, sharing what she could while maintaining the discretion that her former security clearances still required. But for the first time since leaving the military, she felt the satisfaction of using her complete professional identity rather than just a carefully edited portion of it. That Thursday evening, Alina found herself driving to the community center where the Women Veterans Support Group met. She'd been thinking about Corporal Davis's request all week, weighing it against her own need to move forward rather than backward. The parking lot held a dozen cars, representing a dozen different stories of military service and civilian adjustment. The meeting room was arranged in a circle, chairs facing each other with the kind of deliberate equality that suggested everyone's voice mattered equally. Alina recognized the setup from various briefings and debriefings over the years, but the atmosphere was different, softer somehow, less rigid than military gatherings. The group facilitator, a former Army medic named Janet who'd served in Iraq, welcomed Alina with the casual warmth of someone who understood that showing up was often the hardest part. Around the circle sat women of different ages and branches of service, united by the common experience of wearing uniforms in a profession dominated by men. "Would you like to introduce yourself?" Janet asked, her tone making it clear that participation was voluntary, not required. "I'm Alina," she said simply. "Air Force, 8 years pilot. Got out 3 years ago and I'm still figuring out what comes next." Nods around the circle indicated that her experience was more common than unique. The conversation that followed touched on familiar themes: the challenge of translating military skills to civilian careers, the difficulty of explaining experiences that most people couldn't comprehend, the strange sensation of living in a country at war while going about the peaceful business of ordinary life. One woman, a former Marine sergeant named Tors, talked about the assumptions people made when they learned about her service. "They either think I'm some kind of superhero, or they're waiting for me to have a breakdown. They can't just see me as a person who had a job that happened to be in the military." Alina found herself nodding, recognizing the dynamic Tors described. She thought about Rodriguez's initial reaction, about the way her students' perception had shifted when they learned about her background, about the careful balance required to honor her service without being defined exclusively by it. When the meeting ended, several women approached her with the kind of recognition that transcended words. They'd seen something in her bearing, heard something in her voice that marked her as someone who'd been tested under conditions that couldn't be simulated. "You should come back," Tors said as they walked to the parking lot. "It helps having people who understand." Alina promised to consider it, and for the first time she meant it. The following week brought an email from Commander Webb that changed everything. It was brief, professional, carrying the weight of authority that came with leading men in dangerous places. "Phoenix, my team has been tasked with a training exercise that requires civilian aviation support. Specifically, we need someone who understands both military requirements and civilian airspace regulations. The exercise involves cross-training with local law enforcement on counterterrorism scenarios. It's a 2-week evolution, good money, and a chance to use skills that don't get much exercise in the classroom. Interested? Webb." Alina stared at the screen for a long time, coffee growing cold in her cup as she processed the implications of the offer. It was exactly the kind of opportunity she'd told herself she didn't want. A chance to step back into the world she'd deliberately left behind, to use capabilities that had been forged in places where making mistakes meant people died. But it was also something else: recognition that her skills had value beyond the classroom, that her experience could serve a purpose in the space between her military past and her civilian present. The exercise Webb described wasn't combat. It was training, preparation, the kind of work that helped ensure others would be ready when real emergencies arose. She thought about her students, about the lessons that couldn't be taught from textbooks. She thought about Corporal Davis and his earnest request for someone to explain what flying was really like. She thought about Tors and the other women in the support group, searching for ways to honor their service while building meaningful civilian lives. Alina reached for her phone and dialed Webb's number, her decision made before she'd fully recognized making it. Alina, Webb's voice carried surprise and something else, hope maybe or relief. When does the exercise start? She asked. 3 weeks. You'll need to go through a background refresh for the clearance, but your old credentials should expedite the process. Send me the details, Alina said, feeling something shift inside her chest. Not quite excitement, but a recognition that some paths led forward by acknowledging rather than abandoning the past. Phoenix is back. The words felt strange in her mouth after 3 years of civilian life, but they also felt right. She wasn't returning to her old life. She was finding a way to integrate it with her new one, to be both the professor who taught aerodynamic principles and the pilot who'd learned those principles in circumstances that textbooks couldn't adequately describe. Outside her window, a red-tailed hawk circled over the campus, riding thermals with the effortless grace that had first inspired her to fly. Alina watched it soar against the Colorado sky, understanding finally that some things were meant to be shared rather than hidden, that legacy was built not by forgetting the past, but by using it to create something better for the future. The clearance process took exactly 18 days, a bureaucratic miracle that spoke to the government's continuing faith in her judgment and discretion. Alina spent the time preparing her classes for a 2-week absence, arranging for a colleague to cover her lectures while she disappeared into the classified world of military training exercises. She told her students she'd be attending a professional development seminar, which was technically true even if it omit.